Good morning, everyone. My name is Aaliyah Linton, and today I'll be presenting my project, The Continuity of Control, the shifting faces of patriarchal control over women from witchcraft in the 1600s to hysterics in the 1800s. I would like to begin with a quote by Angelina Grimke. She was actually the first woman to be represented legislator in the US, and she stated in 1837 that women were not perceived as being men's equals in society. Instead, they were perceived as toys or pets, something to be willed into submission and obedience. But what happens when a woman doesn't submit? Today, we'll be exploring that by looking at the question, how did the transition from witchcraft accusations in the 1600s to hysteria diagnosis in the 1800s reflect evolving patriarchal methods of controlling women? And what roles did religious as well as medical authorities play in shaping this control? In my research, I found that overwhelmingly there's a lot of scholarship on these events separately. There are articles like that from John Demos and Neil Shurik that consider them separately as gender studies, but do not consider them together. I used many articles like this in order to look at the historical context as well as through a gender studies lens. In my research in particular, I used two nonconforming women as case studies. The first being Bridget Bishop, who was the first woman executed in the Salem witch trials, and the second being Elizabeth Packard, who was committed to an institution by her husband under the guise of hysteria in the 1800s. For Bridget Bishop, I looked at primary documents that were transcripts from the original Salem witch trials. And these primarily were male-dominated trials, so a lot of it isn't in her own voice. In regards to Elizabeth Packard, there was overwhelmingly a lot more in her own voice as I looked at her authored novels, which range from marital power exemplified, modern execution, and even further with her The Hidden Life of a Prisoner. Let's begin with the Salem witch trials. They began in 1692 and ended in 1693, which is only a year. It's not very long, but this was a very influential time. It was characterized by a fear of witchcraft and increased religious tensions in Puritan society. They believed that the devil was among them, and there was supernatural influence changing their society in a negative way. This led to trials, accusations, and 20 executions, majority of which were women. The first of these executions was Bridget Bishop. At the time, she was roughly 60 years old. However, a lot of the trials indicated that the things that were being recounted happened years prior. Throughout all of the documents, she is described as being outspoken, independent, and very argumentative, things that were really looked down upon in Puritan society, especially among women. And this makes her a really good case study because she kind of shows the nonconformity that I'm looking at. In all of the trials, it outlines that there were personal conflicts or arguments that started the interactions with Bridget. And in particular, they really revolved around money or other altercations with men. And all of these men reported strange sightings or visions in their room. They would see her standing in their room at night. However, you can't really confirm this. Men and women alike credited misfortune and unexplained event towards her. It was ranging from children falling ill, family members dying, or even with just losing money. It all started with her original influence over them. She had cursed them because she was angry at them from their argument previously. And a lot of the accusations originated from young girls, making them towards older women. And this is really important because those were the people who were experiencing supernatural harm, such as pinching, punching, or seizure-like symptoms. But moving further to the 1800s, there was a shift from religious to medical control. The church was still a very dominant institution, however, medicine was becoming increasingly prominent. And because of this, nonconformity in women was redefined as mental illness, which was acceptable at the time rather than witchcraft. And coverture laws allowed male control over wives, and this really presented itself in the form of men being able to institutionalize their wives without any trial or evidence or any sort of representation. They had nothing to fight against it. And this was the case with Elizabeth Packard. Though she had already been institutionalized before whenever she was just 19, the second time was by her husband. It started with religious and marital conflict. She had expressed to her husband that she wanted to talk about her different religious views in church, and he condoned this. However, whenever she was met with a flashback, or she was met with a lot of negative reactions to this in church, the church had committed her under pressure to conform societal marital norms. So instead of simply the church doing something, they had influenced her husband to do this. But this still shows that the husband had an increasingly amount of control, and he did use medicine and doctors in order to imprison her. And throughout her imprisonment, she experienced mistreatment and a loss of autonomy. No matter what she did, she was insane or hysterical. There was nothing she could do to fight back against this. And though these cases are separated by centuries and so much events happening, there were many parallels in their persecution. First, both cases, there was violation of gender norms. Both were women, and both were imprisoned by very strict norms. First of all, with Bridget, she was very outspoken and independent. She argued with men, which was something that was really looked down upon in Puritan society. And then in the case of Elizabeth Packard, it was just her disobeying the church and her husband. And because of this, she faced a lot of repercussions. And in both cases, there was institutional control involved. For Bridget Bishop, instead of it being medicine, it was the church, a very predominantly male institution. And for Elizabeth Packard, it was medicine and doctors. Psychiatrists were predominantly male at the time, so there wasn't really any female advice or influence in that. And in both cases, there's a reframing of defiance. First, you're a witch because you do not adhere to the laws. And then second, instead, you are hysterical. You're insane, and there's nothing you can do about it. And in both cases, there was a loss of voice. These women lost their autonomy because each institution used very circular reasoning. In Bridget Bishop's case, she claimed that she didn't even know what a witch was. And the person prosecuting her said, if you do not know what a witch was, how do you know you aren't one? There was nothing she could do. So in that instance, no matter what she said, she was always going to be a witch and she would always be executed. And in the case of Elizabeth Packard, it was very much the same thing. She refused to conform to her husband's religious views, and because of that, he refused to release her. She was trapped there until he released her. And much of the doctors experienced the same thing, where they would repeatedly tell her, and this is expressed in her books, that if she did not conform to these views, then she would not be released. No matter how many times she said that it was just differing views, it was instead looked at as a symptom of her insanity. In conclusion, in both cases, there's a shift in authority. Though it's not extreme at this time period, it did happen later on. There was a shift from the church to medicine, while this case is kind of in the in-between. There were also changing frameworks, and with these changing frameworks, there was changing rhetoric. Like I said previously, what had condemned you as a witch was now condemning you as insane. You were hysterical, and there was nothing you could do to fight against it. And in both cases, they punished defiance, especially in women. And this was the case because a lot of the victims of the Salem witch trials were women, as well as a lot of the victims who were deemed hysterical in the 1800s were also women. And in both cases, women lose their autonomy and voice. Like I said previously, there's the circular reasoning. There was nothing they could do to fight against it. They were trapped in this prison and told to conform or to die. For future research, I think it would be really interesting to look at internalized misogyny, because in a lot of these cases, women were involved, and in a lot of these cases, women internalized this and used these patriarchal norms against themselves as well as other women. I would also like to look at literature with similar themes or topics, such as the Yellow Wallpaper, that kind of explore this. And then, in addition to this, to make it more modern, it would be interesting to look at modern experiences of women. And this is with predominantly male fields, such as physicians, contractors, or just the general workforce. And this can be in just interacting with people who are of higher power than you, or interacting on the same level. These are my sources. There's quite a few. And thank you.